Okay, let's start then. Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Katesco. It's really great to have so many of you joining us tonight. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Nigel Lezama for our History of Dress research lecture, which is titled Throwing Shade on Paris, 19th Century Capital of Fashion. Nigel is an associate professor of fashion studies and inclusion at the School of Fashion at Toronto Metropolitan University. His research sits at the intersection of fashion, luxury, literary, and cultural studies, examining how marginalized and peripheral fashion and luxury practices transform dominant culture. Nigel's co-edited volume, Canadian Critical Luxury Studies, Recentering Luxury, was published in June 2022 by Intellect. And we are really happy to have you, Nigel. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen. Marvelous. Thank you very much. So firstly, I'd like to thank you, Liz, for inviting me to speak today. This has been quite an enriching experience for me to sort of think about some work that's been floating around in my mind for the past little while, and I've really enjoyed fleshing out some ideas that I'm going to share with everyone today. I'd like to thank also Dr. Grace Williams for organizing all of the tech behind the scenes things. I am such a Luddite, and Grace has made it so simple for me to be here with you all today. As well, I'd like to thank the Courtauld for hosting this event. It's such a pity that I couldn't be there in person. I have wonderful memories of being at the Courtauld back in 2018. I was presenting at the Association for Art History Conference in a fascinating panel with a number of art historians. I'm not an art historian by trade or training, which you will find out soon enough. But what came out of that conference and that time at the Courtauld was a marvelous book edited by Royce Mahawati and Jackie Wilson, entitled Dangerous Bodies. And I spoke about hip hop and fashion at that time. And it was work that was already promised elsewhere. And so I did some other work in that book, which was also fascinating, on manicures in Black culture. So that's a book you can check out that came out of a conference from the Courtauld Gallery. So I'm speaking to you today from Toronto, the city colonially known as Toronto, which is on Turtle Island, stolen Indigenous land, colonized by Great Britain and France during the past centuries, that I will be invoking in the context of French fashion and its discursive role in the history of British and French colonialism. I think it's important to position myself in my work so that my students and other scholars and the public understand the motivations that underpin my work. Among many aspects of my identity, the one that I think is important to highlight today is that I'm a queer scholar of fashion history and theory. And so what this means is that my work is meant to be world-making, world-building. And I use this term in the spirit of José Esteban Muñoz, the queer scholar who asserts that minoritarian subjects hold a complicated relationship with instances of dominant and normative culture. So also in the spirit of Muñoz, I hope that the work that I share in the classroom and with others, particularly today, helps us to think differently and perhaps even better about the world we live in and its structures, which were imposed by colonialism and are perpetuated by contemporary neocolonial and hypercapitalist systems. So the myth of Paris, capital of fashion, has a long history of almost 400 years. Many fashion historians, foremost among them Valerie Steele, have written at length on the city's glorious rise as a fashion hub, starting from the reign of Louis XIV in 1638. And by the end of the 17th century, Paris was home to many skilled artisans and craft workers. The revolution of 1789 brought with it an abolishment of the Ancien Régime guild system, which opened up the market even further for skilled labor and wider access to more affordable, ready-made fashions throughout the 19th century. As a site for pleasure, 19th century France was a feast for all senses and tastes, from the seedy to the seemly. Various narratives were spun to support the construction of the city as a world capital of fun and fashion in the field of cultural production. These characterizations were deeply gendered. So in Fashioning the City, for example, Agnès Rocamora, who's written this book, shows how Paris as a pleasure capital was attached to various female figures from the 18th century to the contemporary period. So Rocamora explains that from the reign of Louis XV, and here I'm citing her, it was commonly believed that there was an intrinsic link between fashion, frivolity, Frenchness, and femininity. From representations of the marchandes de mode to the grisettes, actresses, and then later the courtesans, guidebooks, physiologies, and fashion magazines, some of which we'll be examining today, attach the image of the city to these fashionable figures. So Rocamora argues in this volume that the feminization of the myth of Paris was tied to a shift toward democratization during the 19th century. However, what I'm hoping that we will uncover today is the signs that point to a firmly undemocratic undercurrent to this myth of a feminized Paris, capital of fashion. Through the figure of La Parisienne, the city is represented in a dichotomous manner as both sinner and saint. So we can think of Eugène Sue's Flirty Rigolette, the single girl seamstress in the July Monarchy literary phenomenon Les Mystères de Paris. Or we could think of Zola's man-eating Nana in the eponymous novel published during the Third Republic. So embodied as the cheerful and chaste grisette in the popular literature of the first half of the century and the sulphurous courtesan at the turn of the century, Paris as pleasure capital was a myth constructed equally through gendering and fashion. As metaphors for the pleasures and dangers of the city, these figures are remarkable for two reasons. Ironically, both figures are representations of liminality, the working class seamstress, and the declassed prostitute operated in the margins of French society. So in this way, as signifiers of the city's status, they weren't completely representative of the ideological intent of the construction of Paris as a fashion capital. Nevertheless, fashion was a central characteristic of La Parisienne in both iterations. And let me just make this move, if it will. Well, we get the idea. The dichotomous image of the Parisienne still holds currency today. So we can think of John Galliano's most recent artisanal show from Maison Margiela, which was a breathtaking ode to the Hungarian French photographer Brassai and his fascination with Paris nightlife. So the cast of models in this show could also be construed as occupying the margins of the fashion world. Galliano used a number of curved models rarely seen on haute couture runways. These models embodied the contradiction inherent in the figure of La Parisienne. I'd hoped that we would see a bit of the show, but perhaps what I didn't do was link this to online when I turned it back on. So, but you get the image from this, you get the point from this image here. And so what I want to sort of pull out of this show is that while Galliano's garments lean into the scandal of the bordello, Pat McGrath's porcelain makeup treatment foregrounded a doll-like innocence, which we see here in the face of the model here, a doll-like innocence that gave each look the uncanniness of alabaster statues brought to life by the affections of their overzealous sculptor in an overheated 19th century opera. And you can Google the show. It's marvelous. So what's interesting about this long-standing representation of Paris as capital of pleasure and fashion is that this construction instrumentalizes marginalized femininity at the manifest level, while at the latent level, the myth is meant to incite middle and upper class consumption. In the 19th century, the construction of Paris' capital of fashion is a hegemonic figuration seeking to express cultural dominance and promote a form of cultural imperialism that could buttress France's position as metropole, while the nation faced a number of significant challenges, all since the start of the century. So there's a triumphalist convention in historiography and cultural discourse to treat the fall of the Ancien Régime as the ground from which modern France, modernity, and liberal democracy sprung. The revolution is treated as a degré zéro, that is to say, a cultural reset that placed France on a new path to greatness. In the nation's new age, fashion and luxury became one of the signs of the progress wrought by the revolution. We can think about the incroyable and the merveilleuse, so these two figures that we see, these three figures, well, the two that we see here, the incroyable and the merveilleuse, whose outlandish fashions at the end of the 18th century signaled their distancing from the political dress at the height of the revolutionary period. Through fashion, these young post-revolutionary dressers sought to represent a new age free of the turmoil of political upheaval. And so, as Valérie Steele asserts in Paris Fashion, they were utterly modern and asserted their fidelity to the cause of fashion through their fashions. Shortly thereafter, with the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, the young Corsican military man, fashionable and luxurious dress were once again politicized, signaling through an aesthetic inspired by an idealized classical Greece and an ideology of white supremacy and Eurocentrism inspired by it, the newly minted empire and its straight path to glory, predicated on a classical heritage of dubious origin. In this so-called modern era, fashion was a key symbol used as proof of a purported French cultural superiority. So in their discourse-changing volume, Fashion and the Post-Colonial Critique, which is from 2019, Elke Gogele and Monica Titan remind us that fashion was instrumentalized as a measure of cultural attainment and is still used to signal cultural dominance. So invoking the decolonial fashion scholar Sandra Neeson, Gogele and Titan write in their introduction, and here I'm citing from that introduction, who has and who does not have fashion is politically determined, a function of power relations, end of quote. So in European and particularly French and British modernity, the idea of fashion as a system of ever-changing style that provided grist for the Western economic mill was used comparatively to justify the colonial order. Fashion was treated as a specifically European phenomenon that contrasted favorably against a vestimentary practice supposedly rooted in tradition and thereby the past of non-Western and non-white cultures, and particularly for those who found themselves on the receiving end of France and Britain's colonial projects. However, the construction of French superiority through a discursive representation of fashion supremacy seems more symptomatic to me of the instability of this myth than a sign of a real investment in French ideology. Rather than following the positivist depiction of France's triumphant entry into modernity, the historian of 19th century France, Robin Mitchell, shifted this discourse in her groundbreaking book from 2020, and here we have an image of it on the screen, Vénus Noire, Black Women in Colonial Fantasies in 19th Century France. So in this book, Mitchell argues that it is not the French Revolution, but rather the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804 that introduced France and French society into modernity. So from this perspective, French modernity is not marked by a hard-won progress inscribed in French culture and in white bodies, nor was it materialized in fashions that cite from great white cultures of the past. France was the first European colonizer, in fact, to face defeat at the hands of formerly enslaved Black people. And Mitchell writes, and here I'm quoting Mitchell, "The loss of Haiti and the collapse of Napoleon's empire threatened France's self-perception as an imperial power, with its connotations of racial superiority and its image of its masculine prowess," end of quote. So in this light, France was forcibly thrust into a modernity marked by the loss of the imperial nation's crown colonial jewel and the forced return of thousands of French Creoles to the metropole. In a recent project that I presented at a conference at the University of Bologna, I explored the impact of this original loss on white French masculinity during the century and how the perception of fragilization played out in men's dress practices. In reaction to the destabilization of power dynamics through colonial loss and the continuing internal power struggles of 19th century France, white masculinity became a nexus of anxious scientific, political, and literary discourses on the failure of masculinity to become, on the failure of France's young men to live up to the glorious, gilded masculinity of the revolutionary period. The mal de siècle, first diagnosed by the Romantic novelist, poet, and playwright Alfred de Musset in his 1836 novel, La Confession d'un enfant du siècle, was a generalized feeling of masculine incapacity to meet the challenges of the time. Symptomatically, it's very easy to draw a genealogical arc in the literary representations of young white male inadequacy in French 19th century literature. So we can go from René by Chateaubriand, Constance Adolphe, Balzac's Lucien, Hugo Zernani, Flaubert's Frédéric, Maupassant's Bel-Ami, and so on and so on. I was originally a literary scholar, a 19th century literary scholar, before I shifted into French, into fashion theory. That's why I remain firmly rooted in a literary perspective, at times anyways. So the young men in these novels and plays are all attractive, objects of female desire, but all prove to be inadequate to the cultural expectations imposed on white French masculinity. So alongside the morbid literary fascination with young men's innate incapacities, there was also a drive to bolster a perceived degeneration of men's bodies through scientifically inspired tailoring techniques. So fashion historian Alison Matthews David, who was a new colleague of mine at the School of Fashion at Toronto Metropolitan University, Alison examined how the drive to quantify white French men's bodies to pinpoint average heights, weights, and life expectancies in the scientific field, how this drive was instrumentalized by tailors who, through fashion, sought to alleviate real men's anxieties over their bodies, which did not seem to live up to the proposed and idealized standards drawn from positivist research. So through technological developments, 19th century tailors proposed various ways to correct the perceived somatic imperfections with more and more precise tools to measure men's bodies. So we can speak of the costumomètre, the longimètre, the somatomètre, the anthropometre, all the way to the humble and still used tape measure, were all a part of the multiplication of 19th century tailoring inventions meant to help create an appearance of white male supremacy through vestimentary scaffolding. Fashion, not only in its conceptual form, that is to say, as a signifier of modernity with its connotations of progress and cultural supremacy, but also in its material form and practice, was an essential tool in the Western project of domination and white supremacy. For this reason, it's important to name aspects of fashion that remain unmarked and thereby appear as natural, when in fact they are discursive, meaning that they function normatively to support dominant cultural systems and constructions. So in my study of 19th century white French men's dress practice, I found that the cultural backdrop of anxiety surrounding white masculinity and the practices in the field of fashion to reinforce this masculinity make it important to name the three-piece suit that emerged and became standard men's dress by the end of the century and well into the 20th as ethnic a garment as the jalabas that North African men or the kimonos that Japanese men wore in photographs taken by European travelers and ethnographers at the time. So in 19th century France, the three-piece suit is the garment that white Frenchmen wore to denote racial and class belonging, gendered status, and cultural dominance. Fashion was one of the tools used to represent the modern, metropolitan, colonial, and therefore masculine order. Fashion was harnessed in France and other metropoles to materialize cultural dominance. A three-piece suit was not a neutral or standard garment without ideology. The suits worn by white middle-class French men must be read as ethnic garments as much as the so-called traditional garb that many foreign sitters donned in their daguerreotypes for the Museum of Natural History and those images that we saw in the previous slide. But for European men, the cut of their coat confirmed their status as white, male, and middle class, which collectively informed their ideological and racial hegemony. In this light, it's curious that fashion as a hegemonic tool was symbolized in France as a female figure, la Parisienne, along with the cultural baggage of her marginalized status. So despite its political charge, fashion was situated in the feminine sphere of activity of 19th century bourgeois society. Middle and upper class white men in their built-for-purpose suits occupied the public sphere of business, banking, and politics. Middle-class white women were charged with the responsibilities of the domestic sphere, or if they needed to work, if they were relegated to the labor in the field of fashion, working in the domestic space as seamstresses, embroiderers, or other lighter manual labor, or they were relegated to the more demanding labor of laundry women, for example. Later in the century, in the newly created pseudo-domestic space of the department store, women found work as shop girls. Paradoxically, in public discourse, fashion became the symbol of Parisian singularity and concurrently French gloire, yet most of the women who labored in the name of fashion were not accorded the same political import, and none were granted access to the power of the political field. In the fashion press at the time, fashion remains discursively a feminine occupation and one that operates outside of the masculine sphere of politics. So in the January 20th, 1831 issue of Le Petit Courrier des Dames, Annales des Modes et des Arts, the distinction separating feminine fashion and masculine politics is made clear. Fashion is presented as a remedy for the weighty concerns of the day. And here I'm taking a quote from this journal, this fashion magazine, when I was doing some archival research in the fall. And so we see here in this quote, finally, it seems that a need for distraction has suddenly taken hold of everyone. We spend the days arguing the policies of all the cabinets in Europe. We discuss the interests of the Poles and the Belgians. There are not even the most naive students who do not inquire about the troubles of Mount Caucasus. And through all of this, we order garlands of feathers, chiffon dresses. We think of the bouquets that you will be offered in the evening, and we hope that the party will be brilliant, because ultimately we must have fun in the interest of commerce, and perhaps also in the interest of the mind that seems to ask for only an easing of the severity of current concerns. And so these are all translated. I've translated them myself. So in this quote, what we see is that fashion intercedes in the political realm only to provide respite from the imposing concerns of international politics. While heads are laden with thoughts of the future of Poland and Belgium, both of which having launched independence revolutions in 1830 and each with differing outcomes, the anonymous fashion writer proposes that thoughts of fashion bring much needed levity to currently weighted heads. We notice that fashion is constructed as a feminine concern through the gendered garments and the role that the imagined reader occupies. Fashion and politics, in this ideological formation, occupy distinct fields. Fashion is not conceived as political. It is merely welcome distraction from political thought. However, later in the same year, fashion is granted political potency as a sign of French cultural superiority. In this construction, fashion becomes a tool of a cultural imperialism that replaces an evidently faltering national political and economic imperialism. In this excerpt from the December 10th, 1831 issue of the same magazine, the anonymous journalist adopts the tone of political commentary to describe the power of Parisian fashion and taste. And here I'm quoting again from the Petit Courrier des Dames. And again, it's my translation. The inventions of taste and elegance achieve their high point in the moments when Parisian society, expanding with all that the countryside gives us of pretty women and men of good taste, becomes without a doubt the model for all European societies. This era is the triumph of all the ingenious fashion rivalries, the reward for the labors of industry, the example of which provides pleasure for all countries. In order to best understand the domination of French fashions, we browse our brilliant boutiques and we will determine whether our reputation is well earned. Evidently, according to the journalist, it was. So here, the writer constructs a French fashion hegemony whose power complements the nation's political aspirations, which had come to naught through the failures of the First Empire. Parisian taste and elegance become, in quotes, the model for all European societies. Parisian fashion is given an international portfolio. So more than just a je ne sais quoi, the writer is careful to bind Parisian fashion to industrial production, which discreetly connotes an economic and colonial strategy by, again, quoting the article or the excerpt, providing pleasure for all countries. The end of the writer's introduction to the season's fashions and their Parisian purveyors cements the imperialist construction of Paris fashion by characterizing Paris fashionability as the domination of French fashions found in the city's boutiques. It's significant that while fashion may reside in the private sphere of feminine activity and be symbolized in the figure of marginalized femininity that is la Parisienne, in the discourse drawn from these examples of early 19th century French fashion press, fashion crosses symbolic borders to colonize the public sphere. In this period of anxiety around the faltering state of masculinity and its political activity, it's through discursively feminine preoccupations that France can find the lost domination of the political field. Fashion shifts in the magazine's discourse from a distraction from politics to another mode of political action for the nation. So this gendered substitution in the context of the crisis of white masculinity suggests that the feminine sphere of activity may have gained stature in 19th century France. However, if stature was to be found in feminine cultural production, it was also tightly bound to class and race perceptions. Despite the symbolic embodiment of Paris as the fashionable yet non-hegemonic Parisienne, in Paris fashion press discourse, it was precisely this liminal urban figure who was excluded from Paris fashion's dominance. So in an editorial in the mode section of the Petit Courrier des Dames on November 25th, 1845, so this is near the end of the July monarchy, another anonymous journalist expressed the class-based biases of French dominant culture in an ironic moment inserted into a piece meant to extol the qualities of Parisian furriers. And so here I'm going to read again a quote that I've extracted from this magazine and that I've translated. The muff, made of beautiful cat fur, which simulates the marten, or the stole made of young rabbit, on which small black hairs are strewn, forming a tail, and marked at very low prices, is the seduction of the little seamstress who, in her clogs, walks past this vulgar display, or even of the poor provincial woman who is unaware that A few steps away from these counterfeit goods are found grand fur houses, where they will always find much better and cheaper products. So, in this quote, it's precisely the least dangerous iteration of the Parisienne, the grisette, in other words, the seamstress in her clogs, alongside the provincial woman whose non-Parisian origins make it impossible for her to correctly decipher appropriate Parisian fashions, who are excluded from a hegemonic understanding of fashion. So according to the journalist, these working class and non-urban women are easily seduced by fake and poor quality fashions. When, were they more judicious, they could easily find appropriate fashions of good value that represent the accepted taste that constitutes Paris fashion's hegemonic power. Those outside the dominant classes cannot decipher approximations or low-grade counterfeits from dominant fashion. So while Paris fashion can dominate other Western nations and expand France's cultural glory in the absence of an expansion of French political glory, the true appreciation of Paris fashion's power requires a specific type of class belonging. In earlier 19th century France, class is still the key determining factor for belonging to the fashionable set. While race is also an exclusionary factor within the realm of Paris fashion, the race of all dominant players in the field remained unmarked, meaning whiteness was treated as a natural quality of those who could participate in the game of fashionable self-presentation. Non-white foreigners eventually entered the Paris fashion landscape as voluntary or forced émigrés, or in the context of tourism, and this is particularly during the Second Empire. However, the presence of racialized otherness also worked to confirm the dominance of Paris fashion. For example, images of non-white visitors to Paris were treated ethnographically as signs of alterity, or their adoption of European fashion was considered as an unsuccessful attempt at integration into dominant culture. This meant that during the first half of the century, class status was the most active category of difference that separated those in the know from those who could never get it. A telling example of the representation of the power of class in interpreting Paris fashion is found in Balzac's Illusions perdues. So in this well-known novel published during the July Monarchy, but set during the earlier Restauration, so that's during the political regime that restored a Bourbon heir to the throne after the fall of Napoleon. So in this novel, Balzac recounts the rise and fall of Lucien Chardon, a young or naive, power-thirsty, but beautiful white young man from Angoulême, from the province, who arrives in Paris in search of literary glory with his high-born provincial lover and protector, Louise de Bargeton. They escape their town under cover of night and set up in a simple Paris hotel. Upon their arrival, Louise contacts her powerful Parisian cousin, La Marquise d'Espard, a bastion of French taste and fashion. So narratively, Louise is compared unfavorably to the Marquise. Her clumsy and old-fashioned practices of self-fashioning betray her provincial roots and garner the bemused or condescending looks of the Parisian elite. The Marquise nevertheless takes Louise under her wing, advises her to abandon her low-born protégé post-haste, and takes charge of her fashion renaissance. The narrator explains that despite her provincial fashion faux pas, it's Louise's social status that ensures that her ignorance transitions to enlightenment. Balzac writes that Louise, and here I'm quoting the novel, possessed the native haughtiness of good birth and that indescribable something which may be called pedigree. So in fact, the narrator's prescience is confirmed shortly thereafter. Abandoned to his own self-pity by Louise, Lucien blindly wanders the streets of Paris, This is a marvelous scene. I love this scene that I'm about to invoke. So his self-pitying reverie turns to impotent rage when he spots his former lover and her cousin riding in an open calèche on their way to the nec plus ultra of fashionable Parisian events to see and be seen Sunday afternoon on the Champs-Élysées. The narrator describes in rapturous detail Louise's sudden transformation into a style maven. And here I have a translated quote from the novel. Lucien beheaded, I was about to say, he wishes. Lucien beheld Louise transformed beyond recognition. All the colors of her toilette had been carefully subordinated to her complexion. Her dress was delicious, her hair gracefully and becomingly arranged. Her hat, in exquisite taste, was remarkable, even beside Madame d'Espard, that leader of fashion. It's evident that in the first half of the century, Paris fashion is conceived of as belonging to a caste that only admitted those whose social capital naturally converts into the appropriate cultural capital to assert dominance in the field of power. Because of her aristocratic class status, during a period of monarchic restoration, Louise can deftly adopt, or is constructed as being able to deftly adopt, prescribed Parisian fashion practices. Louise and her cousin can wield fashion like a social weapon, but they do not become symbols of Paris fashion's dominance. So what I mean by that is that they cannot be reduced to the figure of la Parisienne. Their class status shields these elite women from that type of reification. They act as agents of Paris fashion's imperialism. So in the discursive formation of Paris fashion as political force, the internally contradictory construction of la Parisienne as the symbolic embodiment of French cultural dominance in the avatar of marginalized femininity signals the antithetical role that fashion was called to play in the public realm. So relegated to the feminine sphere of private activity, fashion was not meant to hold political sway in the public realm. However, as 19th century France lurched through numerous political regimes, trying to find the right system to lift the nation to its former glory, and cultural anxieties swirled around white masculinity and its apparent incapacity to sustain the glory of the previous century, France fashion was conscripted to fill in the gap. If war against Europe and Great Britain could no longer guarantee supremacy, if colonial domination was not a fail-safe system, then France would have to guarantee, France would have to satisfy its need for supremacy by instrumentalizing cultural production. Troublingly, the form of cultural production that would be harnessed would fall squarely in the perceived field of feminine activity. As the source of French prestige that could radiate out from the capital to colonize and civilize other Western nations, Paris fashion was itself an internally contradictory force, at once feminine and masculine. Masculine, because in the context of French gloire, Paris fashion was called upon to perform a very public and political duty of materializing and expanding French hegemony. Feminine, because in post-revolutionary France, fashion, with its emphasis on appearance and surface, was deemed a frivolous activity and was gradually confined to the semi-public feminine space of the department store. These palaces of pleasure blended the comforts of the domestic space with the commerce of the public space to entice women of the dominant classes to consume the luxurious fashions and goods that were amassed under their roofs. Feminine consumption, however, was not linked to French cultural glory, but was in fact a source of anxiety as an expression of female desire that risked toppling masculine achievement. Literary depictions of women gone wild with consumer desire, such as Flaubert's Madame Bovary and Zola's Au Bonheur des Dames, attest to the morbid fantasy of fashion's power to bewitch and women's inability to just say no. In this troubling context, a public polemic ignited in June 1865 in the political realm when the austere and venerable Senator André-Marie Jean-Jacques Dupin delivered a diatribe against women's unbridled taste for luxury in the French Senate. And this is a speech that he had immediately published after the Senate session. And so I'm going to quote from the senator's speech here, and also translated by me. When one goes or has to go to a party, when one wants to cut a figure and doesn't have any money, self-esteem wins the day. Reluctant to tell the husband, so obviously we're talking about women, reluctant to tell the husband the marital fund is empty, one dresses on credit, signs notes, letters of exchange for which one seeks endorsers, and the maturity of which is always fatal to virtue, thundered the senator in the Senate session. So through the summer and fall of 1865 and into early winter 1866, journalists, society women, playwrights, and poets all entered the fray, either in support of, but for the most part dismissing the senator's fulminations. Real women's supposed desire for luxurious fashion became the site of a public debate as to the social value of luxury. Senator Dupin argued that fashion was not a source of national pride, rather a source of shame, as desire for fashion turns honest women into dishonest ones. His argument was not new. A quarter of a century earlier, Paris Police Commissioner Béraud, and this is the book that came from, I found this in the archives as well some time ago, published a report on Parisian prostitution entitled Les filles publiques de Paris et la police qui les régit, so the prostitutes of Paris and the police that govern them, in which he also linked female desire for fashionable dress to their turpitude. And I'll quote from the police commissioner's volume. Oops. As New Year's Day approaches, Epiphany, Assumption Day, girls want to offer gifts or beautiful bouquets. They also desire for themselves a new dress, a fashionable hat, and deprived of the necessary financial means, they find them by giving themselves over to prostitution for a few days. I'm sure we're all laughing right now. Okay, so in dominant discourse, fashion is the slippery slope that leads from honest seamstress to street seductress. That it is La Parisienne who symbolizes fashion in its imperial glory reveals both the conflicting perception of fashion and the gender and racial trouble that mark dominant culture in 19th century France. The presence of fashion in the discourse of political imperialism itself is twofold. On the one hand, fashion was a source of economic growth and cultural expansion for France, and as such, held a rightful place in the public realm and its discourse. On the other, the fact that France needed the soft power of fashion to express its hegemony signaled the inadequacy of conventionally masculine fields of power or forms of power. Troublingly, fashion not only signaled the nation's dominant status, it also hinted at the risk of masculine weakness, both at home and in the political sphere. In his argument against women's frenetic desire for luxury, Senator Dupin betrays a fear of the destabilizing potential perceived in fashion as an activity of the feminine sphere, and proposes the solution that it would be through the collective example of respectable mothers to counter the extravagant fashion taste being set by courtesans. And here I'll quote again from the senator's speech. For my part, I would like there to be a society of mothers who, without ceasing to dress and present themselves with decency, and even with the luxury that suits their fortune and their status, would set the example of ruthlessly extracting the superfluous, and would thereby come to the aid of the other classes who, through proximity and by imitation, always want to reach a summit which it is not given to them to attain. So rather than a site of cultural hegemony, in the eyes of the senator, fashion is a destabilizing force, emerging from the feminine sphere of activity and requiring the controlling influence of a society of austere and respectable white and French mothers to set the tone for a society turned on its head through women's so-called unbridled taste for luxury. La Parisienne, it would seem, is not the appropriate symbol of France's authority, moral, political, or otherwise. It's this perceived disruptive power of the feminine sphere, particularly in light of the perceived decline in masculine hegemony, that troubles fashion's entrance into the political field. It can seem that fashion is simply another tool used by the nation to support the perception of and the desire for French hegemony. However, the century's entrenchment of separate spheres of activity should preclude the need for intervention from fields of activity outside of the masculine. Yet the field of fashion consistently remains a source of chauvinist pride and the sign of French cultural hegemony. So what's interesting is that when French men's fashion becomes the object of discourse, it seems that their styling practices are more prescriptive than in the discourse focusing on women's fashion. In men's mid-century fashion magazines, it's not so much a question of style as it is of dressing appropriately. So in Le Lion, Journal des Nouveautés des Modes d'Homme in January 1860, the fashion advice proffered by the writer leans into a form of conservatism to protect the wearer from eccentricity. And so here I'll quote again from the fashion magazine Le Lion, and again, it's my translation. So one might have believed at first, judging by the spontaneously widespread taste for long clothes, that the strength of the season, which promises to be rigorous, seconded by the whim of many of our fashionables, could well bring some exaggerations, according to certain enthusiasts, too apt to create or adopt strangeness. The movement stops halfway, and according to men of good breeding, the adoption of the middle of the road is infinitely more pleasing. So men do not have access to the same fashion liberties that women do, particularly in discourse. There's an underlying protectionism in written masculine vestimentary practices that precludes the type of singling out that women's fashion practice permits. There is the undercurrent of a search for le bon ton, a requirement for both men and women to reflect good taste that runs through all 19th century fashion discourse. However, this discourse becomes far more restrictive and prescriptive for men, as if a fear of divergence from the norm, a need to remain safely in the middle of the road, impeded men from a full exploration of their fashionable possibilities. The shadow of the dandy seems to lurk behind the discourse of men's fashion. So we think of the whim of many of our fashionables, and fashionable is the word they use in the French version as well, italicized. As the writer from Le Lion says, which aligns with the fear of somatic degeneracy that impacted tailoring practices throughout the century. So in a sense, despite the white masculine domination that many historians and sociologists attribute to the rise of industrial capitalism in 19th century France, white masculinity was a far more undermined identity category, precisely because it was meant to represent the unmarked and dominant subject position of modernity. So that if white masculinity could not in itself be the dominant position, it could assume the dominant position by discursively pushing down other categories through constructions of gender, race, ethnicity, and class. In response to a cultural anxiety about white masculine inadaptability that exceeded the spheres of public activity and cast doubt on the conventional areas of political hegemony, French fashion could fill a gap by asserting its capital is equally as hegemonic as the capital expected of masculine spheres of activity, but in this case, coming from the field of culture. The issues that undermined the perception of white masculinity would not matter in the field of fashion as long as it wasn't men's fashion practices that were used as the model, as these were constrained by fears of slipping into a deviant masculinity characterized by fashionable excess. As an already ideologically constructed subordinate cultural practice, women's fashion discourse was not hemmed in by cultural anxieties around a loss of status or of degeneracy. Fashion's natural insouciance in this construction could be instrumentalized to become a source of its glory without contradicting the structures of masculine activity and hegemony. In a sense, fashion's imperialism remains circumscribed because of its attachment to the feminine sphere of activity. Its importance could be heralded, but as a cultural practice, any power the field of fashion wielded left the conventional spaces of masculine activity intact. Fashion could buttress national chauvinism, but because it was constructed as a feminine occupation, it was not a threat to masculine domination, or it should not be a threat to masculine domination. However, in the context of a perceived masculine pathology, it's easier to understand the ideological double construction of fashion, symbolically embodied in the figure of la Parisienne. So representing both the moral and the immoral perceptions of femininity, la Parisienne and the field of cultural activity she embodied could only be treated equivocally, precisely because fashion as a source of cultural hegemony also required an eclipsing of masculine domination in the field of power. And so now I'm coming to the end of my talk, where I'm going to focus on a few images that I came across while I was in Paris in the fall, and maybe the spring prior. Figures by Degas, images by Degas, and by Boldini. Boldini from that marvelous exhibition on Boldini in Paris in the spring, I think it was. So looking at two contemporary artistic representations of women who each occupy opposing activities in the field of fashion, we can examine the tension surrounding the cultural drive to imbue fashion with an imperialist power that was lacking in the political realm. So this charcoal, white chalk, and pastel sketch, this one on the left, on my left anyways. So the sketch of a laundry woman ironing is one of the first in a series of works that Edgar Degas dedicated to these working class women. So this 1867 image is a first sketch and a staged depiction of a woman ironing. The woman depicted is a well-known artist model from the time, Emma d'Aubigny. In the sketch, she wears a white scoop neck, cotton blouse tucked into a dark skirt with a light blue apron tied at the waist. In her right hand, the model holds an iron on an expanse of white that economically represents a length of fabric. Her arm, outlined and then perhaps shifted to the right, rests on the edge of the surface on which she labors. Her head, with its strong jawline, which is highlighted by her auburn hair tied up and back, gazes off the picture plane to the left. Her cheeks are slightly colored, as if flushed from a bout of intensely physical labor. In the foreshortened background, Degas has rubbed white chalk, giving the effect of a diffuse and smoky background. The similar rapid gesture of chalk rubbing along the woman's work surface, I don't know if you see my mouse, but along here by the edge of the apron. So this similar rapid gesture of chalk rubbing along the woman's surface and the background also suggests that Degas could be representing hung laundry commissions that surround the fashion laborer. In an unfinished painting from the same period, so this painting that's on the right, it features the same model in a similar moment of interrupted work. In the painting, the laundrywoman's gaze meets the viewer's. She stands once again with the iron in her right hand, but this time with her left arm hanging by her side. The scene, more developed than the sketch, evokes an interruption so that the viewer is placed in the role of a bourgeois client who has come to see when her commission might be ready. The laundry woman has an affectless gaze, signifying that the interruption is neither expected nor wanted. In this painting, the white chalk background of the sketch is replaced with a wall of hanging whites that form a barrier enclosing the laborer, showing work that's to do or that has been recently done. So fashion is not an empowerment in this image. Fashion represents the hegemony that subjugates those who do not belong to the dominant classes. Degas' two representations, the sketch and perhaps what is the final composition, highlight that fashion is not simply a sign of cultural hegemony, but is also a source of domestic, and domestic in the political sense, subjugation, and particularly so for working class women. So now moving to the Italian painter Boldini's portrait of an unknown woman in a white silk ball gown with mutton sleeves, which is entitled Feu d'artifice, and was painted between 1892 and 1895. This painting is a remarkable society portrait for its powerful representation of French fashion at the height of its discursive power. Much like his artist friend Degas' work, Boldini's portrait uses a gestural stroke to give weight and energy to the fashion represented. The model's dress is quite detailed along the bodice and the shoulders. Boldini paints the ribbon detail. Here we see it, if you see my mouse, I'm pointing to this ribbon detail of the bodice and the folds of the exaggerated mutton sleeves. The light reflects off the planes of the wearer's left sleeve and what seems a ribbon detail that hangs from the bodice to the waist. Beyond this, the white dress seems to dematerialize in a plethora of vigorous brushstrokes. As the painter focuses on the fashionable garment, he shifts away from a linear style to adopt a painterly approach that fuses the garment and the wearer. And so what I mean by this is as he moves down the wearer's body, Boldini no longer adheres to a precise fashion representation. So below the waist, the dress becomes a series of brushstrokes so that the portrait becomes an abstraction. Both the borders of the wearer's body and the dress lose their contours as the wearer's arms become just as gestural as the dress at the hem. And so we see we lose all of the glove, the contours of the body and the arms of the wearer in these vigorous brushstrokes. Both the borders, yes, as I've said, so both the borders of the wearer's body and the dress lose their contours. The wearer's arm become just as gestural as the dress at the hem. So Boldini continues his vigorous brushstrokes beyond the confines of the garments, outside of the dress itself, so that what the viewer sees is not a portrait of a fashionably dressed woman, but the effect of the woman's fashion on the beholder. So in a similar but obverse manner to Degas' image, Boldini's portrait highlights the hegemonic power of Paris fashion to impress and envelop wearer and viewer in the mystique of Paris, capital of fashion. However, Degas' image, which also represents the hegemony of Paris, capital of fashion, or Degas' images, focus on the class and gender-based domination experienced by those not fortunate enough to be able to wield fashion's phantasmagoria, but who are only enlisted to ensure that it is properly starched and pressed. So these two representations suggest that fashion as a field of hegemonic activity occults real women's labors and presence from the activity. Despite the centrality of the female figures in both images, whether she comes from the elite or from the dominated classes, fashion is depicted as either containing or overtaking her. In this way, the construction of Paris, capital of fashion, could function as a sign of cultural hegemony, rescuing France from political inefficacy in the conventionally masculine sphere of activity, precisely because fashion was constructed as exceeding if not overpowering, the feminine sphere of activity and the women who were relegated to it. So, final sentence. If there was a Paris capital of fashion, it was a capital that was overshadowed by the anxieties of failing white masculinity and the political hegemony that it was meant to promote. Thank you very much for your attention. And I hope you enjoyed this sort of exploration of the myth of Paris, capital of fashion, as much as I enjoyed preparing it for you. I'm going to stop.
Thank you so much, Nigel. That was super fascinating. So I'm going to look at some of the messages in the chat and ask you them. Okay, so Robin has asked if you could explain a little bit more about the department store. You mentioned how the frivolous activity of fashion was confined to the department store and how it enticed women of a lower class.
Enticed women of, I was speaking of the middle and upper classes. So the department store, the department store emerges sort of around the Second Empire. So the Second Empire, I am a literary historian, so my dates are always fuzzy a bit, but we'll say, let's say from the 1860s. From the 1860s onward is this emergence of these department stores that have a history before of like bazaars and small boutiques that sort of merge into bazaars. So they become these larger shopping spaces. And so the department store, when it emerges, we can think about Émile Zola, who was writing about Au Bonheur des Dames, who writes about the emergence of the department store that shifts sort of like there's a change in social practices at the time because these department stores are using relatively new processes of selling. So they're presenting ticketed prices on the goods for sale, whereas in earlier decades there would be bargaining that would happen in these smaller shops. So the prices are ticketed. There's a plethora of objects. So ready-made fashions, whites for bedding, sheets, dishes, everything. It's just, and it's created in department stores in the way that department stores sell fridges, for example, is set up now. But what one of the perceived concerns is that these spaces, which were feminine spaces because they also adopted practices to make them feel sort of like home, so that women would be comfortable to be in these spaces. Whereas in earlier times, women of the middle and upper classes didn't walk the streets. If you were walking the streets, you were busy doing something else. And so they turned the department store into this sort of hybrid space that was at the time public, because that's where you went shopping and went to get goods, but it also had the comforts of the home. So it had salon where women could go and rest, have tea, that kind of thing. And so in this space, women could express certain desires. And we would talk about sort of desires, sublimated desires, right? So this desire for shopping could be conceived almost as another form of desire. And so the danger was that women were let loose to express these desires. And so, for example, in Zola's novel, certain women, certain characters in the novel bankrupt their husbands from over shopping because the store is too much of a seduction for them. Other women take to kleptomania because these goods because you can touch and feel them, which is also a new practice at that time. Elicits sort of sensual pleasures, and so they start to steal them. I'm reminded quite some time ago, I did some work on kleptomania. It was I'm trying to remember. There was in 1910 there was a psychoanalyst who worked on women and kleptomania, and sort of this fascination and this fear that the department store became the space where women's natural proclivities for excess could be unleashed in that way, in the same way that we see in the senator's speech about women's unbridled taste for luxury. So it's this real worry about controlling women's natural desires, essentially. And I think that is what elicited a sort of fear around the department store. So when I'm speaking about that sort of that tension, it's through that kind of worry of this female space, of this new feminine space that is public and private at the same time, allows women to give in to their natural proclivities, their perceived natural proclivities. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Nigel. So then I have a question from my colleague, Paul, and Paul has asked, are there examples of specific men or male archetypes who transgress the middle road of good taste, and how were these understood?
Oh my God. I love those ones. The dandy, right? So my early work was focused on the dandy in 19th century France. And so I think we all know that history, particularly if you're speaking from or viewing from Great Britain. George Brian Brummel, the father of all dandies, the godfather of all dandies. And so we often talk about dandyism as sort of a precise form of vestimentary practice. And so a lot of the work that's come out on dandies really sort of constructs this figure who is a model of perfection, but a model of good taste, of exceedingly good taste. But like in my own work, and particularly in the French context, when the dandy moves over, like in the early 19th century, he shifts over to England, and the style becomes a little more prevalent, and it becomes a fascination for authors at the time, for novelists at the time. There is like sort of an adoption of a certain kind of exaggeration. So this Gaelic dandy is not as starched, I would say, as the British version. So like in terms of like these men who sort of cross the Rubicon and leave the middle of the road, I would say almost every young man written into 19th century literature. My favorites, there is in Les Mystères de Paris, which was the serial novel I spoke about briefly, the Vicomte de Saint-Remy. And so this, I think, is a typical example that I can give about the worries around masculinity and its excesses and its fragility, right? So this young man, absolutely beautiful, impeccable taste, beautiful house, that in his house, in fact, is both, like when the narrator describes it, it has like a feminine space, which is the music room and the garden, and then this masculine space where he meets his friends and they play cards, and he keeps his collection of guns. And so he is like the influencer of Paris in this novel. And so the novel takes place in like the late 1830s. And so what we find out about him is that, and so all the while there's a sort of narrative, we're being seduced, the reader, in the narrative depiction of this character. The descriptions of them are also quite similar to the way that women are described in these novels. And so what we find out about him is that he's in fact penniless. He doesn't have a dime to his name. And like he's acquired all of this beauty, all of this wealth, all of this excessive beauty and wealth in the ways that the senator would describe it, through ill-gotten gains, through forged notes and things like that. And so he asks his father for help, and his father is actually quite similar a character to Dupin, you know, austere, serious, like all dark clothes, heavy shoes, and like a real castrating figure. And the father says, okay, I'm going to help you. I'm going to give you this gun to shoot yourself so that you don't dishonor yourself. And the family name. And there you go. And I've helped you. And so in the end, the character ends up he escapes to Poland, I think, where he lives in disrepute. And so there are numerous figures like that. Lucien de Rubempré, so the young man who came to Paris in Illusion Perdue, he's another figure that that crosses that middle road and exceeds the acceptable practice of masculine dress, and is again also punished narratively in the novel. Ends up, he rises, he has this like great rise to the top of society, and a equally as like quick and tragic fall into death. So these kind of figures we could think of in real life, for example, like in real life, but like historically, the Comte d'Orsay, who is a famous like figure from the early 19th century. I think he had, if I remember correctly, he had his own perfumes made, always flowered, was bisexual, and this was also another sort of mythic figure of a character, of a masculine figure who crosses the middle road. So yes, there are tons of them. And obviously I can go on, but I'm going to hold off.
Okay, so then Julia has asked, is the fashion world today any more sophisticated or still as divisive?
That's an interesting question. There is so much going on in the fashion world right now. I spend a lot of time in Europe, because by training I'm a 19th century French literary historian, so I'm in the archives there often, and I see a lot of the fashion exhibitions, for example, and I see a lot of I've been to some shows and those kind of things, and I read all of the stuff, obviously, every fashion magazine. And I feel that there is a real shift happening now, that I think is so much stronger, significant, I even say significantly stronger in North America, in terms of fashion. And there's a real movement of decolonization, of inclusion, and of sustainability that I think is really foregrounded in North American fashion, in the field of North American fashion, that still has a way to go in Europe. Europe has like such a weighty history of fashion and of its gloire, that I find that it's hard to come out from under that. Whereas in the States, there are marvelous designers and brands that are doing work that I think foregrounds inclusivity and decolonization. I'm thinking of like the brand Pierre Moss, which is one of my favorites. I'm thinking of Telfar. I'm thinking of Luar. So Black fashion, that's one of the areas that I work in as well. And in Canada, there is tons of great work done by Indigenous designers that really foreground traditional skills, and that are looking to sort of bring back these traditional skills that through the colonization process were taken away from Indigenous nations and Indigenous cultures. So there's a lot of work happening, important work in North America that I think Europe could look to, and maybe draw inspiration from.
Thank you. So then Nada has said, thank you for this wonderful talk. It's really informative. To what extent has Parisian fashion influenced English women's attires and appearances in the Regency period, 1811 to 1820?
That is a super good question that I wouldn't feel comfortable answering because I would just be guessing. But what I can say about that kind of like cross-channel influence is that French fashion really was the model that was adopted for French women's fashion was the model adopted for like the West. And I'm speaking super generally, and whereas like British tailoring in the 19th century carried much more, for men, carried much more weight internationally. I'm thinking there's a couple of examples that I haven't that come to mind, and it's not, unfortunately, it's not for the British Regency period, but I'm thinking of Edith Wharton's The Age of Innocence, and you know, on the Americans, the New Yorkers would go on their grand tours and they'd bring back their Paris fashions, but they would lock them away in a trunk for 2 years and wear them 2 years later so that they didn't appear too fast in the sense fast. And when I'm from Trinidad, and so when you say you're too fast, it has a real moral connotation to it. So Paris women's fashion had, I think, a great deal more power than French men's fashion did at the time. The other example I was thinking of was, but this is more popular culture. I'm thinking of Gone with the Wind, and when Scarlett O'Hara comes back from Paris with all of her new fashions, we see, and that's talking about the 1860s, we see that power of women's fashion as it expands to colonize the other Western countries specifically.
Jenny has asked, she says, thank you for such a wonderful lecture. She hadn't thought about the notion of white supremacy as an expression of fashion. I wonder how visible other ethnicities were in Paris at the time. Would other races have conformed to the white fashionable aesthetic in Paris?
Thank you. That's a marvelous question. And that is part of the work that I'm going to be starting to do now. There were always, as you know, as long as there was colonization, there was other ethnicities in Europe at all times. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm always clear to state that if I'm speaking about, in this case, like French masculinity, I'm speaking specifically about white French masculinity because there are other ethnicities around. Particularly, as I said, in the second half of the century, there's a bit more movement. And I'm like, sort of at the, like in terms of like famous examples at the beginning of the 20th, you can think of like Josephine Baker, but before that, there were tons of artist models. The Black body was a site of fascination for French artists all through the 19th century and the 18th. So there were artist models who were there. Laure is an example from the 1860s. Laure is the model who is in Degas' Olympia, right? And so Olympia is the prostitute who's lying on the chaise longue, and then there's a woman holding flowers behind her. There's a black cat and a black woman holding flowers behind her. That model, Laure, she's a famous artist model who's been in many works by Degas and other artists. In the early part of the century, there were also artists. There were also black women, black people. Joseph is an artist model who was in the Raft of the Medusa. He's at the top of like it's a sort of triangular type composition, and at the top of this raft, there's a figure that you see from the back who sees a ship, so it's like a figure of hope. That's Joseph, and he's Martinican, if I remember correctly. So there are specifically Black people in France in the 19th century, and prior to that, through colonialism, earlier through slavery. Some came over post-emancipation to find work as artist models, to find all kinds of work. And so I'm going to be looking into this further. As I develop this work, I need to focus much more on who were these other people who came into, who were in France, and who impacted their perspective of whiteness in France. And obviously, I'm forgetting the most obvious figure, and that is Sarah Bartman, La Vénus Noire, who is, I'm not sharing my screen anymore, but I had an image of a South African woman, Khoisan woman, sort of in a state of undress, wrapped in beads, with large buttocks, Calipigian, you could say. She was there in 1815 in Paris, and her remains were there in the Museum of Natural History for over 100 years. I think they've since been returned to South Africa. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Nigel. I know this is a bit naughty as chair, but I thought, I wondered if I could just quickly slide a question in, because it kind of links. I wondered, can you say a bit more, because I found this really fascinating. It's actually something that I was talking to Royce Mahawate about earlier today. What are these connections between 19th century European tailoring conventions and at the same time this kind of ethnography's physiognomic fascination with the body? Can you say a bit more about that in the way that, you know, kind of non-white identities are being constructed?
Absolutely. Like, and these thoughts come from the work that I was doing on white French masculinity, and that I presented at the University of Bologna. So I briefly touch on it. And so what I happened to find a series of portraits, and I showed them all, these portraits, in the French archives, and that led me to, I was curious about them, and it's interesting, and I wanted to work on them a bit more. So I thought about it, and so those portraits are all around 1855, 1860, in that range, and so it's at a time when photography, the daguerreotype photography, is becoming a little more, it's significantly more accessible for the middle classes. So in an earlier period, that type of self-portraiture would have been done through painting, and it would have been left to the very elite classes. And so with the invention of the daguerreotype, and with its with its sort of affordability, the middle classes now can come in, and they can have something similar in nature to the self-portrait, to these grand portraits, but done through photography. So it's kind of like the middle class portrait done by an artist. But photography it's a complex thing at the time. It's not just taking a picture, right? It's also, it's treated, it's not an art yet. It's science. And so it's a tool for science used by ethnographers who would photograph, like, these people, these foreigners who are coming to Paris. They're coming to Paris during the grand exhibitions, and they're being photographed ethnographically. And those were, I showed a couple of images of that. It's from the photographer for the Museum of Natural History, Jacques-Philippe Poteau. And so he's photographing foreigners for the Museum of Natural History. So I mean, in a very ethnographic way, as, you know, as examples of otherness. And so it struck me that because the daguerreotype is not just a simple painted portrait which represents class, it's laden with like scientific, with its scientific purpose. Sitting for a picture, for a portrait, is not an easy thing. And one chooses what one wears in that situation, so that when all of those men that I'd found, those 15 portraits, these young men in their most of them in their three-piece suits, I was like, okay, that is just as much a decision and just as much a positioning as the positioning that happens in the ethnographic versions of these types of photographs. And so it's not innocent. And so in that sense, they're also expressing something in the same way that the 18th century painted portrait expresses dominance and class and all of this, and money and wealth, all of that. These portraits have to express something, and they have to assert something that's at play in that contemporary moment. And so what's at play, as I've sort of explained today, using the work of using Venus Noire, is that there's a real sort of challenge to masculinity, right? Masculinity is like, it's not feeling itself at this point. So it needs a suit in order to appear as the imagined perfect image of masculinity would be. And so in that sense, it is an ethnographic act. It is an act that places the wearer in a society, in a position, in a class, in an ethnicity, in a race. All of these things are tied to that suit.
Yeah, but okay, I'm going to carry on. Thank you. But the difference surely would be the way in which they were perceived by the European gaze, because the white suit would be seen as kind of moving forwards and progressing and fluid, as opposed to being perceived as changing and unchanging and fixed.
Yeah, exactly. But what I'm arguing, and what I like, because what we know is that, like, that's discursive, that's ideological, right? It's not true, right? That these non-Western fashions are also moving, and also have a fashion history, and are also like they carry the same, they have the same functions. It's just not seen.
Yeah.
And so what I'm saying is that while it's perceived as like constantly moving and constantly evolving, and a representative of modernity, a representative of progress, what it represents is the ideologies of that time.
Yeah. Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, so carrying on. We have time for a few more. Okay, can we take one more question and wrap up? Right. Okay.
This has been great.
Howard Mallarmé's, excuse my pronunciation, 1874 fashion magazine La Dernière Mode fit into this male-female discourse? Mallarmé took on a female, took on a female personae for this project, and seemed simultaneously disparaging of and fascinated by fashion in terms of its relation to his poetry. Critics have regarded the magazine as ironic, a tool to access the female unconscious, part of a greater literary project.
That's a...
So how does the magazine fit into this male-female discourse?
That's a very interesting question. And La Dernière Mode, I haven't worked on in any real way. I've used it a little bit here and there. And I'm not a Mallarmé specialist. But yes, you're right. You're absolutely right. Like, so he adopts this, I forget the name of the persona that he adopts to write this magazine. He does it with a friend who's the publisher, and says, okay, I need this magazine. Why don't you do it for me? And he does it for him, for his friend. And he has fun. Like, I read it as quite fun, quite an exaggeration of that kind of fashion discourse, right? I don't think we can take it au premier degré. I don't think we can take it in the first degree because it's I think deeply ironic in a sense, and it's so symbolic, right? So and what I mean by that is that the descriptions of fashions sort of exceed fashion. They don't. You can't imagine the garment that the narrator or the journalist, and behind that journalist Mallarmé, is thinking of or writing about, because it's so at once vague and precise. I remember, like, he talks about, like, this dress that's blue with the l'acier d'un fer, like the metal of a sword, and the stars, and the garland from the hair that matches the hair that matches the dress. And it's impossible to, like, I have to sit down with it much more to really work on that. And it's a fun project that awaits me. But more than that, I can't really say too much about La Dernière Mode and Mallarmé, other than that I really take it as an ironic adoption of fashion discourse, heavily
Great.
ironic.
Thank you, Nigel. I think, unfortunately, I'm being told we have to stop here, but please join me in a huge round of applause. Thank you, Nigel. That was, it was really, really, really thought-provoking. And I think you'll see that if you have a look at all of the comments. So thank you so much.
Thank you very
And thanks
much again.
everybody for joining us.
It was a real pleasure, and I'm glad that you all enjoyed it. I really enjoyed thinking about these things, and hopefully the next time I'll be able to come in person and see you all.
For sure. Okay, thanks everybody. Round of applause, Nigel. Thank you. Bye.
Oh.